Hey out there, this is Buzz with TheSurvivalBuzz. So I'm sure everybody has noticed the hefty gas prices lately. And of course, our fearless leaders want to rack it all up to what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. And I could see how that'd be a damper on pricing. But let's face it, we were headed that direction anyways. Now it's just going to be a little worse. So with gas prices the way they are, I can't help but to keep wondering and pondering day in, day out, the last few days it seems like, where does this put our future? And I know as preppers, we're always preparing for the future, no matter how bleak it may be. Most of us probably preparing for different scenarios, whether it be nuclear fallout or economic collapse or an asteroid hitting the earth or whatever crazy speculation you want to come up with to prep. But honestly, I just prep for pretty much the inevitable. I guess I would just say economic collapse would probably be the number one thing that I prep for. Or at least that's what it boils down to. But with gas prices the way they're going, I read some article yesterday that, our electric grid is very fragile. It's falling apart. Nobody wants to replace anything. Power lines even are outdated. Just across the board, it's falling apart. And then, of course, the government and everybody wants to cram this Green New Deal down our throats. Green energy, electric cars. It seems like just in the last few weeks, electric cars and stuff is starting to become like the major talking point, with different manufacturers spitting out what they're going to do to help with pollution and stuff. But ultimately, you can't get away from the system that they're creating. Ultimately, there's going to be one day when you're not going to be able to afford gas for your car, no matter what kind of vehicle you have. Let alone it, honestly, the gas probably just isn't even going to be there eventually. The way they're pushing everything. So, I guess to get to my point, with them pushing electricity and the grid already fragile the way it is, and then all this talk about cyber attacks and stuff, you could pretty much kiss all that goodbye eventually too. And I know there's different channels out there, and even I've mentioned it before about solar energy and different things. But I honestly think at the end of the day, we all better get comfortable with not having power, just altogether. And I know it seems impossible. I grew up in a generation as well where there's lights, there's electricity, there's air conditioning, there's heat, there's everything you could possibly need or even want, just a fingertip away. But that's not to say that at one time people didn't survive just fine without all of that. My great-grandmother grew up in kind of northeast Oklahoma area. She didn't even have running water, I think, until she was in like her 50s or 60s. They had an outhouse, huge kitchen, everything was made by scratch. There was nothing in a package. My grandmother had 12 brothers and sisters. They all took care of each other. They all took care of the farm. Also, they could survive. Back then, people had children to help tend to the farm so they could survive. So a lot different world than which we live in now, but they made it. My point is, they made it. They didn't have to have electricity. They didn't have to have air conditioning. They didn't have to have heat. They were acclimated. They knew what to do, how to survive, how to stay warm, how to stay cool, how to feed themselves, even when there was nothing. During the Depression, several families just foraged for most of their meals. So it can be done. So the more prepared you are as far as food and different things, the better. But I honestly think people need to get used to the idea of not having all these amenities, not having electricity and running water and different things. Or at least the ability to cut back. Because, you know, from what I read, fossil fuels account for like 60% of the power that comes from the grid. Don't quote me on this. Don't get all upset and, you know, try to correct me in my comments if you want to. That's fine. I'm sorry I'm not a human dictionary here, but you get my point. The system's already fragile. It's going to start buckling more. You know, the more of these green initiatives that get passed and they want to shut all the fossil fuels down and start everything being electric, obviously supply and demand, we're not going to be able to keep up with that. And then the already fragile system, I mean, you can expect blackouts left and right. I mean, it's already happened more and more. I want to say it's something like over the last decade, we've gone from a few dozen blackouts annually to it's something insane, like a few hundred. So things are kind of starting to fall apart, unravel, and then all the cyber stuff on top of that, you know, everything's hooked into the system now. Everything is fragile. So we all need to learn to survive without all that crap. Now, I don't want the grid to go down any more than you. I love my air conditioning. It's probably the one thing that I would miss the most, I think, if it all went down. I don't like to be hot. I don't necessarily like to be cold either. I'm not a cold weather person, so that kind of puts me in a dilemma. But that's not to say that me and my family couldn't survive. We might not be extremely comfortable, but we would make it. So I really think people need to get in the proper mindset and start thinking of how they're going to survive without all these things, not ways around it necessarily. You know, solar power is a great thing, generators are great, things like that, but those things aren't going to last forever, and you can't rely on that stuff unless you have backups, you know. One is none and two is one, you know, that sort of thing. So unless you have multiple solar systems set up and extra stuff for when something does break or doesn't work, then you're kind of screwed. If that's where you're concentrating all your efforts. So I really think people need to challenge themselves to learn to lower that thermostat, you know, make it a little colder in the house in the winter, or in the summer, you know, maybe not cranking the air down so much, maybe relying on some more fans or a cracked window, and kind of acclimating yourself to this, because it's coming fast. And I know the majority of people out there, some even preppers, are not prepared for this. So it's a lot of state of mind and acclimating yourself to what's to come. It's going to be bad. It's going to be really bad. And as we just swirl further down the drain, it's going to get faster and faster and worse and worse. So people need to start getting ready. Start preparing yourself mentally for these things, or you're not going to make it. If you're anticipating that just everything's going to be great because you got your stockpile, you're dead wrong. You were dead wrong. And like I'm always preaching, skill sets, gardening, livestock, those things are super important. But you got to have your head on straight too. If you're not straight in the mind, you're not going to make it through what is coming our way. So as always, like this video and subscribe if you like what you hear. If you'd like to help support this channel, there's ways to do that down in the description box, as well as ways to contact me. And I will catch you guys on the flip side. Later.